I work at the Ethereum Foundation focused on institutional privacy. So a bit about today's presentation. I'll be going over some of what we've been seeing, some of the conversations that we've had, and then I suppose opening up the floor for questions. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so I think it's always good to start with the problem here. So blockchains, public blockchains by default are public. That means you can see the transactions, you can see the timings, you can see the amounts, the counterparties, and that ends up being like a real problem for institutions where basically by default, the way they've been operating is in a place where they've had privacy. And it gets compounded because what we're seeing is that more and more assets, more and more organizations are moving on-chain in a big way. We have $15.8 billion of tokenized assets on the L1. We have regulation that's basically converging globally. So what's happening is that there's now a regulatory reason for institutions to really take care about this. And then off the back of that, you end up having these various different kind of like, I would say, artifacts of the fact public blockchains are public by default, which is front running. So if you are putting a large order on Ethereum, then there is a possibility that adversarial actors can take advantage of that. I'm sure a lot of people here care about the MEV space. We'll kind of go into this in a bit more detail. There's competitive intelligence that kind of gets leaked. So this could be your strategy for deploying and what you're planning to do. There is the regulatory tension whereby they actually are required to hide certain information. And then there is also the legal and reputational exposure, which is by basically disclosing some of this stuff publicly, it could affect the reputation of the firm, which is basically paramount for many of these. And the fact that we have essentially all of these institutions, and this is a non-exhaustive list, currently on Ethereum building on it, kind of highlights a lot of that. So that's asset managers, banks, infrastructure players, exchanges, technology companies. And one thing that we've seen is that you've often will talk to organizations that have been building on blockchains for almost 10 years. And oftentimes what would happen is that there'd be some type of innovation department that would be kind of experimenting with things. But over the last 12 months, what's happened is that basically it's been moved from innovation and proof of concepts to basically real deployment of large amounts of capital. So this, what that led to is that basically we've been getting a lot of extreme amount of inbound demand around how do you do privacy on Ethereum and public blockchains in general. So taking a quick look at that, there's, I would say, over 750 teams kind of working in this space across all various layers of the stack, whether that's on the application layer, it could be on the protocol layer. It's just a large number. And for Ethereum specifically, I would even go as far as say we've had a dedicated research lab at the foundation for over 7 years, kind of focusing on this space all the way from, we've been working on this for a very long time, and including researchers, cryptographers, and the various different engineers, about 50 people dedicated to this effort. I think one way you could look at this, I think a lot of people like to think of layers. We look at it as a couple of different ways. You could have basic layer at the protocol level. So over time, I'm sure a lot of you are maybe familiar with the Ethereum roadmap. You'll see that we're going to be moving to ZKVM. We'll be private by default. We have the app layer, so organizations and protocols like privacy pools, 0xBO, Railgun, where they offer basically ways for you to get privacy outside of the transaction kind of level. And then there are things like account abstraction. So there's a lot of work happening in this space. It's actually extremely difficult for most people to navigate what's going on and kind of like where it affects in the stack, whether that's at the execution level or kind of like once it's settled, what does that mean? But there's a lot of work here. So that's where our team comes in. So about, I'd say, 4 to 5 months ago, we put together an institutional privacy team with the goal of bridging kind of like what organizations are looking for what's available in the space in a way that's very much EF and open source aligned. So this means basically talking to a vast number of different organizations, hundreds, if not thousands, and mapping out the kind of like the problem spaces they have, the use cases to protocols, teams, products in the space. We've been releasing proof of concepts. I think in the last 3 months, we've done kind of like proof of concepts to show what's actually possible. This is, everything from doing end-to-end privacy-preserving payments to validiums and trace settlement all across the board, and then kind of make sure that everyone has access to this. And finally, like multi-stakeholder engagement. So, connecting, for example, an organization that might be deploying capital and they might have questions on MEV, like should they think about that? What kind of toolings should they use? Should they be using like a private RPC or mempool and these kind of considerations? There's a couple of focus areas here, but I think I can kind of skip that for now. So privacy stack. So I think this is kind of important around the way that the foundation thinks about the roadmap going forward. We often think of it as kind of 3 big areas. Private reads, so like how do you privately read from the Ethereum L1? If you're querying data, how can you do it so people don't know that you're doing it? How do you do it so your metadata is protected? What kind of RPCs do you use? Then there is private rights. So you often hear about this going forward, especially with next year. If you're transacting and you're deploying capital, how is that done? If you are executing a payment, how do you do that in a privacy-preserving way? We talked about shielded pools, this kind of stuff. And then I think the last kind of like area would be proving. So like, how do you prove that you belong to a particular anonymity set? How do you prove that you are able to do certain things without giving up any details about yourselves? So this is probably what you're going to be seeing going forward as kind of part of the new Ethereum privacy roadmap. How does this lead into like institutions and how they think about compliance? So oftentimes there's this like question around or tension between privacy and what does that mean for compliance, because they're like at tension, but actually what we see that's not necessarily the case. What you'll find is that actually it's a bit more of a spectrum, and privacy preserving technologies that allow people, especially allow institutions to interact on blockchains, and they wouldn't be able to if that was not the case. So this kind of like 4 quadrants here is like, I suppose the bottom left is the default. You're private, you're not private, and you're maximally exposed. But then there is kind of like the top left, which is like the Taylor cash model, where like you're private but not compliant, and then that ends up being a problem for many people. I think the green box right on the far right is what we're looking for, where you're private and compliant, and we're seeing a lot of basically solutions in that space. So I think people may have seen a lot of, or have seen a lot of conversations around how we think about privacy. And there's kind of like 2 modalities here. One is that people think about it from the point of view like I suppose users endpoint, which we care about a lot at the foundation, which is like making sure that, for example, a banking platform that may offer payments does it in a way where we can kind of preserve some of the properties of the user's privacy. And here it's interesting because like the kind of like the power dynamics are kind of different. Like the institution has all the power here. The goal here is again to kind of protect the kind of end user. And then there is like institutions to institutions, which is I suppose the vast majority of kind of workflows where like a bank is working with another bank or some other kind of large company. Here, what you'll find is that the kind of power dynamics are more symmetric. Like they both have lawyers, they can both walk away. The goals here are to kind of like hide positions from competitors and things like that. But what's kind of really interesting, so there's a mandate that came out recently talking about the CROPS concept of censorship resistance, open source security, and kind of like privacy preserving properties. And it turns out that actually institutions care about these properties a lot, like an extreme amount. So yes, we care, like end users, it's extremely important, but for an institution, they care about censorship resistance because the last thing they want to do is be working with a counterparty, and that counterparty or someone that controls the network can basically kind of switch off what they do. They care about open source, but they may not use that word because they don't want vendor lock-in. I had a conversation the other day where we were talking to a government entity, and they were like, oh, here are these other alternative networks that we go to. But I think one of the problems with that is, people can control the network. So if there's some strange or some kind of change in geopolitical situation, then that could freeze your entire financial kind of marketplace. So they really do care about that. They care about privacy and they care about security. So I think what we found is that actually a lot of these properties that we try and build for end users also apply to these large institutions. And then there's like N order effects. So like if you work with an organization like that services 100 million people and you can kind of bring in some of these properties to them, you then serve 100 million people with these kind of things that you really care about. So I suppose I just want to end with like, for a lot of people, when they think about these problems, they think about use cases, but privacy is a prerequisite. So almost every single institution that wants to build on public Ethereum, even if they don't think about the first thing, they basically require it. So that's it. I'm open to taking any questions. Happy to answer anything kind of like in space. So yeah.
Any questions from Mo? I have a question. So you talked to different forms of privacy in a transaction. In a institution's journey, when do they realize they don't have privacy? Is it just like one of these myths that floats around and they're all really aware?
So I think it depends because there's like levels of sophistication. Trading firms really care about the execution level detail. They will care about, for example, using a private RPC. They'll care about if the mempool is encrypted. They may even care about like the block builders. And for example, I actually had a question the other day about ePBS, right? So those guys will care, especially if you're like a quant trading firm. For the vast majority, when people think about banks, I think that's a bit different. Like they don't really know about MEV or they don't really know about like how the block construction is done. So for them, it's more like, hey, look, this stuff is kind of scary. It's like on a public blockchain, like what can we do to kind of resolve that? Usually the privacy conversation comes up second to the use case because they kind of expect it to be there. And if it's not there, it's just like not going to happen.
Interesting. And does like Solana or these other networks have solutions or?
So people often kind of think that because we're at the Ethereum Foundation, we don't look at other networks. We do extensively. They have some solutions for sure, but they also have other trade-offs. I would say you could say I'm biased, but I generally think the Ethereum community is by far the furthest along when it comes to institutional privacy. We offer solutions at almost every level, at every stack across the entire spectrum.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Any other questions?
Earlier on, you mentioned a couple of different privacy concerns. One was front-running risk, and one was privacy in general. I think there was a few other ones. And at the block builder, I think that privacy considerations have mostly been focused around preventing front-running and these kinds of abuses. But at the same time, unexecuted trade information also, depending on the system, isn't revealed. Sometimes it is in some of the systems, and it's not really a property that people think about that much. But how important do you think relatively between the front-running risk and the just like general non-executed trade privacy? How important do you think those are relative to each other?
I would say it's extremely important, and for many reasons. Like if an institution can't really figure out like what that means, this is one reason why they're very happy to use, for example, privacy preserving L2s, because they feel like if they do the execution off chain, they can kind of basically subvert those problems. I do think it's a big problem, and it's it is something that we get asked about a lot. I don't know if there's a perfect solution because this space is changing a lot, right? The new AIPs are out, and then there's things like if you have, for example, an inclusion list with like a private transactions, it costs more, and there's other considerations that go into that. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. Like, do they care? Yes, they do. If they don't quite understand it, they want to take as much of the execution off chain as much as possible. Ideally, we want to change that, hopefully over time. Sweet.
Awesome. Thank you, Mo.